In this video, we're going to be talking about brake lubrication. We're going to be discussing different types of brake lubrication. We'll be discussing some things that should never be used as brake lubrication. We'll be talking about signs and symptoms of brakes that require lubrication. We'll be showing you where to apply brake lube on caliper-based brake systems, such as this one. And also drum brake systems like this one right here. So stay tuned and let's get started. So when you're out and about driving and you just kind of wonder, like, what are some of the signs and symptoms of poor brake lubrication? When we lubricate brakes on a vehicle, whether they're drum-based brakes or caliper-based brakes, we have to lubricate the moving parts. If they do not have adequate lubrication, then they're going to make noise. That's just what happens. One of the most common noises you'll hear is a loud, kind of high-pitched squeal when you actually apply the brakes. And that's a sign that components are rubbing together and it requires brake lubrication. That's the #1 sign. Let's hear what that noise sounds like right now. The second symptom you may see is when you're actually braking the vehicle, it stops in stages. So if you apply the brake, the car will kind of hop a little bit. It'll have a little hop feeling about it. So the car's braking and it kind of like hops a bit, carries on braking, hops. So it kind of jerks as you sort of apply the brakes. This happens mainly in caliper brake systems where a sliding pin can kind of get hung up. And we'll look at that in this video as well. And the third one, which is more of a severe sign, is if you hear a grinding sound when you're braking. Now, yes, this could be that your pads have worn down and they're scratching the rotors, for example, but it could be because the slider pin is stuck, which could have been prevented with brake lubrication. All of these things we'll cover when we look at the brakes in more detail, but these are the 3 most common things you'll notice. Now let's talk about brake lubrication products. Before we talk about products that are suitable and we can use, we're going to discuss some things you should never use when lubricating your brake components. And the #1 thing, anti-seize. Anti-seize should never be used on moving parts. I don't care if it has copper in it or what, or it supports the temperatures. This will re-solidify and it will not work. Maybe a few months, maybe a year, but never use this stuff on brakes. Anti-seize is great on things like maybe spark plugs or making sure wheel bearing bolts don't get seized in, or anything like that. It has great uses, it's a great product, but brake lubrication, absolutely not. Okay, another misconception. A lot of people think silicone paste is the same thing as dielectric tune-up grease. Now, yeah, these do sort of have similar purposes around wiring. You put it on delicate wiring and terminals to prevent salt, dirt, corrosion, or stuff like that. It's a great product, the tune-up grease. However, do not use it on brake systems because, again, when brakes heat up, it can re-solidify and it's going to do you absolutely no good at all. Another product, anything like WD-40 or garage door lube or anything like that, you put it on bolts, seized on bolts to try and loosen them. Great product for that, but never use these products on brakes at all. It's really dangerous. In fact, if that ever gets on a pad or a disc, you are asking for trouble. Never use products like WD-40 anywhere near brakes at all. So we've talked about the things you should never use. Now, how do I identify a product I can use? Maybe we haven't discussed it already, or something new will come on the market in a year or two's time. Now, the common denominator of these products is that they have to support high temperature braking applications. So in performance things, up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, 250 Celsius, something like that. It has to explicitly say that, or it should say something like, you can use it on brakes or something like that. Either of those work. So #1, temperature. #2, it should be good on metal, but it should also support kind of rubber gaskets and things like that. Gaskets swell up when we use the wrong product. We do not want this to happen, especially on sliding pins and things like that. Things will get seized, pads will wear down, you'll be in trouble. So that's another thing as well, supporting rubber and gaskets and boots and things like that, as well as the temperature. So now we know what to look for in a brake lubrication product. It makes it a lot easier when shopping around. So over on Amazon here, especially in the US, they really push these Permatex products here. And all these products here, I'll link in the description below so you can, check those out, whichever one suits you the best. So let's look at this now. So this one right here, this is the Permatex Silicone Extreme one. They have an Ultra, they have an Extreme. Now the Extreme one, like we said, we talked about temperature and also the ability to work with rubber and things like that. And this one does exactly that. You can see the temperature supporting there. It talks about brakes specifically, and it's also okay with rubber and everything. So this one is a really good product. You get 8 ounces for, around $23. You can get a smaller version if this is just, something you're not going to do that often. Exactly the same product. You get less value for money, but you don't get stuck with a huge 8-ounce tub. Now this one, this is what I see a lot of people go for. Pretty much the same thing, but it's the Ultra version. And what you'll notice is when you kind of dig into this, you'll see metal to metal contact. And this is the problem here. This would work on drum brakes, no problem, metal to metal, where the shoes, hit the sort of back of the brake system. We'll look at that in a moment. However, if you put this on a sliding pin on caliper brakes, we'll see this too, then it's not going to work. They're going to swell up. They're not good for rubber. But even it says here, look, suggested applications, caliper pins. Now this is where it gets confusing, and this is where people leave kind of reviews saying this doesn't work, or some people say it works great, and the big argument is, well, why does this product exist when this one does the same thing? Now I'm telling you from experience, I've put this on caliper pins in the past because I wanted to save $5, and it made the little rubber thing swell up. It caused the caliper pin to seize. My brake pads wore down a lot quicker, and I realized that this is the problem with this. This product I do not recommend on caliper pins or anywhere around rubber. Metal to metal, yes. Caliper pins, no. This product here, now this is like the catch-all product. This is like a really good product in my opinion, and that's why I own it. So the dielectric grease, again not to be confused with tune-up grease. It has the temperature range, very good. It talks about brake caliper pins explicitly. It's talking about O-rings, rubber gaskets. It works great with rubber and everything like that. And it also has the temperature range. That means we can use it on all our braking systems. Now this product, it's great because you can not only use it on brakes, you can use it on wiring, battery terminals to prevent corrosion. It's a really good catch-all product, and that's why I personally recommend this one over everything else. This is a brakes part lubricant, but I don't know if I'd put this on my battery terminals, for example. And it's almost $23, whereas this one here is cheaper, but you can have more use with it. It's one of those multi-purpose products. That's why I recommend this one. You can choose what you wish. This one, it works fine. There's your temperature right here. It also works with brake pads, calipers, so it mentions brakes specifically, but also talks about rubber. It's fine. It's a good product. It works. And next, silicone paste, dielectric grease. Works on metal. Does it talk about temperature? I'm not really seeing much, but it is a silicone paste. This does work. I've seen people use it. Here we go. Brake systems, rubber bushings. It's just a silicone paste. It's a more branded version of this one. It's a little bit cheaper, so why not? And this one as well. It's unavailable, but it's pretty much the same thing. It's a silicone paste. So this one, and this one, all pretty much the same product, but by a different company. So this is how it works. This is what we look for. We look at temperature. We look at the materials we're working with. Again, a cheaper product like this one, the Ultra, yeah, put it on metal to metal contact, but really it's just nice to have one tool for multiple jobs, and that's why I recommend this product here. So now we're going to check on the vehicle if our brakes need lubrication. I'm going to start with the front caliper brakes on this vehicle and then the rear drum brakes afterwards. Whichever brake system you have, you'll know how to do both in that case. So before we jack the vehicle in the air, we're just going to break all the lug nuts here, and that way we're not doing this with the car in the air and potentially making the car fall off the jack stands. So we're just going to break these till they're a little loose, every one of them, and then we're going to jack the vehicle up. So now all the lug nuts on both sides on the front have been broken. We're going to engage the parking brake, and that will put a lock on the rear wheels, preventing the car from rolling away. Extra safety on the rear wheels isn't always a bad idea, and that will further prevent it from rolling off the jack or jack stands. Now the front end of the vehicle is on jack stands on both sides. We're just going to remove both wheels. Okay, so this is a caliper based brake system right here. Here you have the brake rotor or brake disc. Here you have pads here, and they come in contact with the disc. So while the wheel is spinning, you step on the foot pedal. It creates hydraulic pressure from the master cylinder. Here the brake fluid comes down this hose here into this piston, one or more depending on the vehicle, and that pushes the brake pads against the disc here, causing the vehicle to stop. And inside here, I don't know if you can quite see, there's one of the brake pads right there, and there's another on the other side, and the other side of the vehicle is pretty much exactly the same. There's a very simplistic view on how a caliper based brake system works. So what we want to do now is remove this brake caliper. Depending on your vehicle, year, make and model, it's all going to look a little bit different, but the idea is you'll probably have a couple bolts, one along here and one down the bottom here, and when we remove those bolts, this caliper will pop off the brake rotor. On this SATURN VUE here, we have a 14mm bolt right here and one along the bottom as well. We're going to remove this bolt and also the bottom one. With both bolts removed, just take this brake caliper. You may need to loosen it up with a rubber mallet or something like that, but it will eventually sort of pry off like this. And when it's removed, always have like a container or something like that, because it has a brake line attached which doesn't really want to be flexed at all, otherwise you're going to damage the brake line here. And just place the brake caliper on the container there. So what we're going to do now, we're just going to look at these brake pads real quick. While we're in here, I'll just show you. Now this is the brake pad material here, and what happens is when this wears all the way down, it comes down to this steel kind of metal base here, and when that comes into contact with the brake rotor, that's where we're going to get a grinding sound when we apply our brakes. And this is a sign that our pads are too worn, and now they're too worn, they've damaged the brake rotor, so you're going to have to replace both of them anyway. We usually measure brake pads looking at this kind of groove down here, and you can see here it has kind of like medium wear, but any lower than that you should start looking at replacing the brake pads. So these are the brake pads, and these are what are called brake shims, and this is the first thing we'll be lubricating with our brake lube. So these shims here, they're also called abutment clips. It's just another synonym here. What it does, it prevents the brake pad from rattling around in its socket, and kind of gives you a nice kind of smooth braking operation, so this isn't bouncing around when the brake is applied to the rotor here. That's the purpose. And like I said, when we talked about brake lube, it's designed for moving parts, and that's the first thing which is considered a moving part in a brake caliper system. So what you can do is apply a bit of lube to the edge of the brake pads on both sides. And again, there's 2 brake pads per brake rotor, so the other one is behind here as well. We're going to do the same on that one. Just put a little bit of lube on the end here and a little bit on the end here. I guess you can also put it here and here also. When lubing brakes, try not to get anything on the brake rotor here, and also on the pad here where it makes contact with the rotor itself. It is also up to you if you wish to apply a little bit of lube to the rear of the brake pad right here, but in my experience these never really get seized on unless you live in a really rusty environment. I'll leave that portion up to you, but I usually don't bother. So when adding lube, you don't want to go too crazy, you just want the right amount, or just enough. And this part right here is responsible for that high-pitched squeal that we heard in the start of the video. Well, typically anyway. So now we've lubed the first one here against the abutment clips, we're going to do exactly the same for the one on the rear. Check for brake pad wear, just like you did on the first. Again, if these are worn and they need replacing, there's no sense lubing them, just get some new brake pads and do the process on the new ones. So now the shims here, the abutment clips, have been lubed against the edge of the brake pads here. We're going to look at the sliding pins. Now this is one of the biggest failures in terms of premature brake pad wear, and can give you a lot of issues with brakes locking up as well. So the second moving part we're going to lubricate in a brake caliper system are these sliding pins right here. There's one at the top and also one at the bottom, which is actually quite stiff, which is a bit of a concern. So we talked a little bit how the brake caliper system worked earlier. As your brake pads wear, they're going to move in because, you know, the pads are going to be a lot thinner than they were when they were brand new. And these brake pistons will slowly come out. When you put new pads in, you have to compress these pistons back out so you can fit your newer, chunkier pads in. Now, you may think when you press the foot pedal on your car, how do these sort of go back in? You know, wouldn't this permanently be clamped on here, so when you brake your vehicle, how does the car keep moving normally without these dragging on the rotor? Well, this is where the sliding pins come in. So the slider pins here are responsible for the alignment on how the pistons ultimately meet the brake rotor. So when we release the foot pedal, we expect to drive normally. However, if these slide pins get seized in, like here, and they're not allowed to come out and free, then you might find that your pads are getting prematurely worn, because the pistons in the brake caliper are always keeping contact with the pads and the rotor. Yes, the car can drive, it's quite powerful, engines are quite powerful, and what happens is these pads will just wear and wear and wear. It's like if you have a bicycle and the brakes are permanently on, they're just going to wear down, and this is responsible for that kind of hopping sensation when you brake your car. It kind of hops to a halt. So these sliding pins here, we can actually remove them and re-lube them. You can see how this one has quite a lot of bounce here. There's a rubber boot here that prevents moisture, dirt, debris, and anything like that from getting into the lube inside here. And that's why we have a kind of rubber boot right there. At the bottom here, this vehicle has an interesting problem. So this is why it's a good example to show you. You see this one here. It's very, very stiff, and this is a problem. This can cause uneven brake wear, brake hopping, vibrations when driving, all kinds of problems. So this is why lubing your brakes is very important. You can see there's not much bounce at all, and it's actually taking quite a lot of effort to move this in and out. So this is definitely something we need to look at. So the first thing we should do is inspect these for tears. You can see the top one right here. It's got a little hole right there, and that is really, really bad. If dirt and debris, water, anything like that can get in there, it's just going to rust this in. Very, very big problem. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to have to replace this rubber boot right here. There's no question about it. A year's time, 2 years time, even a few months, it will be a problem. So now we're in here, we're going to order these and get it done. But I will proceed with this project so I can show you exactly how this works. So to remove the slider pins, these are only just kind of pinched on. What you can do is just kind of hold this with your finger and just pull this out. Ultimately, you'll just pull out right here. And this is what a sliding pin looks like. So this is the bouncy slider pin, the good one in this system I'm showing you now. Now this car has over 200,000 miles on it, and you can see this lubrication here. It's solidified, it's a bit chunky, it looks disgusting, and I will be surprised if anyone has actually re-lubed this since it came out of the factory. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to clean up these slider pins here. They're caked with old solidified lube, and we're going to inspect them for any issues. When using brake spark cleaner, something like this, yes, it's going to remove all the oil and crud off there, but don't use it on rubber. It tends to cause problems with it. So for something like rubber, soapy water is fine, anything like that. So all slider pins are slightly different. It depends on year, make, model of the car. It really depends. On the SATURN VUE here, we have a slider pin that looks like that. It's all metal. However, on the bottom side of the caliper, there's a little rubber piece right here. And again, before we clean these up, I recommend you remove this and use soapy water or something like that. So we're only using brake cleaner on the pin itself. Some vehicles will have a small little O-ring there instead of this kind of long rubber piece. It really depends. And other vehicles won't have anything at all. So that tiny little rubber piece here, if you use the wrong lubrication or water or anything like that gets into the system, this rubber piece can swell up, and that can actually be responsible for the sliding pin getting stuck in its socket, which in turn causes your brake pads to get stuck in place, causing your brake pads to wear down, and lots of other problems. It could be something as very simple as this tiny rubber piece. So that's quite annoying really, but that's just the way it is. So when inspecting these pins right here, check for pitting or anything like that. If these are rusted or pitted, get them replaced. It's only going to be a problem down the line. If the rubber piece there is swollen, again, get a new one or replace the whole pin. So I've inspected the boots. There's only one with a hole in right here, so I will get that replaced. Any that look good, I'm going to wash it with soapy water, get all the oil and crusted lube out there and refresh it. Q-tips work really well for getting in there and removing all that dried lubrication. Now in terms of brake lubrication, this is a worst case scenario. The great thing about working on cars like this is I can show you the worst case scenarios, and if it happens to you, you know exactly what to do. So because the condition of that brake lubrication on the slider pins was so terrible, I need to actually clean out these sockets here. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to squirt some brake sparks cleaner down this socket here, and also on the bottom as well, because it's all dried and hardened inside. Next I'm going to get some Q-tips and try and get as much of the crud out there as possible. And when it's all clean in there, I'm going to put fresh lubrication in here, so it's going to be sliding in and out like it did from the factory. When doing yours, if your slider pins are nice and bouncy, they have adequate lubrication, there's no rips in the boot or anything like that, then you may not need to do this step at all. But that's the good thing about a worst case scenario, so you know either way. So I've sprayed some brake sparks cleaner in there. I'm loosening it up with the Q-tip here. Then I'm going to respray it. Now it's as clean as I can pretty much get it. I'm going to repeat the process for the one at the bottom as well. So the good thing about brake parts cleaner is that it evaporates really quickly. Now we've cleaned out the top socket and the bottom one for the slider pins. We're going to go ahead and lubricate the slider pins themselves and put them back in. So now we're going to lubricate the slider pin and also these boots as well, since we've washed them out. Because we wash these out with soapy water, make sure they're perfectly dry before applying lube in this case. Because in this worst case scenario, we flushed all the lube out the system, we actually want to apply lube really liberally on here, quite a lot in here and also on the pin itself. If your lube was okay, it wasn't chunky, clumpy or anything like that, but maybe the slider pin didn't really have much of a spongy feel, you could just add a little bit more lube to that and it would just be fine, as long as it has that kind of in and out spongy sensation to it. So when I say liberally, I mean liberally, because I washed out the sockets for these with brake parts cleaner. They're going to be dry as a bone, so a lot of this will end up in the socket, and then the pin obviously doesn't require all of this by itself under normal circumstances. So we need to lube that socket back up. So we're going to insert the sliding pin back in. Make sure these are nice and dry, there's no residue, anything in there, because we don't want to contaminate our lubrication. Use compressed air, Q-tips, whatever you need to do, but make sure these are dry. So before I add the rubber boot on here, I'm just going to run it in and out a few times to make sure the socket is fully lubricated before we reinstall everything. If it feels like it's grinding a bit, it doesn't quite have a nice bouncy feel, we're just going to add more lube until that is the case. So this is a nice amount of bounce on here. So now I'm going to add the rubber boot back on. When adding the rubber boot, don't forget to lubricate inside here as well. So now it's all reinstalled, we're going to repeat for the one at the bottom as well. Okay, so both slider pins are lubricated as well as their sockets here. We're just going to reassemble the brake caliper and everything else. It's pretty much just the reverse of disassembly, nothing really special there. Once we've done this, we're going to repeat this whole process for the other side of the vehicle. I will say one thing when reassembling, make sure you don't twist this cable. It's quite easy to do. You put it down like that, you put it back on the other way around, you can easily get a twist in there. Twisting a brake cable, it's really bad. So just pay attention to that when reassembling. So I've done driver and passenger side now on the front end here on the brake calipers. I'm going to show you how to do the same thing with a drum brake system, and I promise you it's nowhere near as long-winded as brake calipers. So let's get going. Now we're on the rear of the vehicle here. This vehicle has a drum brake system on the rear. Again, if you have calipers on the rear, just follow the first section of this tutorial for the rear of your car as well. But for drum brake systems, you'll be presented with a brake drum like this once you remove the wheel, and we're going to remove the drum. Now what you can do if this is seized on, sometimes it is just get a hammer and lightly tap between the studs here, and that will free it up, and then you can just remove it with two hands on like a 9 to 5 position. Once that's removed out the way, this is what a typical drum brake system looks like. Now you see this powder on the floor, that's the residue from the brake shoes as they wear. Be careful not to breathe that in. You can get brake parts cleaner and kind of dust that all out before you even get started. But these brake shoes on the side here in a drum brake system, they just come into contact with the inside of this drum here, and that's how your vehicle slows down in a drum brake system. So a quick overview on how drum brakes work really quickly. So this little cylinder at the top right here is called a wheel cylinder, and through the hydraulic pressure, which is built up from pressing the brake foot pedal, causes these shoes here on the outside to retract, and they come into contact with the drum. So that's how your vehicle slows down. And the parking brake on the vehicle also interfaces with the brake shoes. It just doesn't use the wheel cylinder. It uses a handbrake cable that runs all the way from the parking brake, but it does pretty much the same thing. Now there's two things we need to lubricate in a drum brake system really, ignoring the parking brake completely. The first one is the behind of these brake shoes. Now all drum brakes are going to be different, so bear that in mind, but on this particular vehicle there's 3 spots behind each brake shoe, so 3 this side, 3 this side, and you can actually get in without removing anything. You pull this forward like so, you can see right there, you can remove about ½ an inch of room, and behind there you can sneak a little stick with some brake lube on. But if you've never done this before, I'm going to disassemble this now so I can actually show you the points that you need to lubricate on this system. But as we take it apart, I'm going to talk about the second thing that may need lubricating, and that's if you have a self-adjuster. So the self-adjuster is this piece right here, you can see with this cog on here, and as these brake pads wear, what the self-adjuster does, it rotates and it pushes the brake shoes out to cater for the lost padding on the brake shoes here. That's how a self-adjuster works. If you're not sure about how self-adjusters work, or you want to learn more about drum brakes, I'll link a video in the description below, so you should check that out, and that'll give you more information about self-adjusters. So as we take this apart, so I can show you the 3 points behind the brake shoes, I'm also going to get access to the self-adjuster so I can lubricate that as well. So the first thing I've done is remove this spring here that goes onto this linkage and in turn the brake shoe. So that just moves that out of the way, and that removes that kind of tension. The next thing we're going to do is remove these springs. Now you just get some pliers on this inner piece here, give it a slight rotation, then these springs should pop right off. There's one here and one here. The idea is we push down and turn, and then it will come right out. So here's a slightly better view of that. You can see the hole only goes one way, and it sits in the hole on the other piece, and you can see this part here. It's slightly kind of diamond shaped where it's long on one side. So it's just a case of rotating the spring out. So now the springs have been removed. They're pretty much responsible for holding in the brake shoes, the left and right brake shoes. Now you can see that, you know, there's a lot more play in there now. I believe there's one more spring in here holding it together, then it should, you know, disassemble. Or you can just kind of pull it out like that. But you can see there's one spring here. So we're just going to unhack that with some pliers. Now I will say one thing, that all drum brake systems are engineered slightly different. Now this is a 2007 SATURN VUE, you know, your mileage may vary, but the thing is about drum brakes is that when you disassemble one, you can always use the other side of the vehicle as a guide to help you reinstall it back together, because there are a lot of bits, you know, involved in drum brake systems. So now we're disassembled, we can actually have a look at the things that need lubrication. So this is the self-adjuster here. This is what it looks like. We'll talk about this in a second, but let's first talk about the bits we need to lubricate behind the brake shoes, because not all of you might have self-adjusters. You might have a drum brake system without these. So let's talk about this last. So you can see here now the brake shoes have been removed out of the way here. You can see there's 3 points here. There's one just here, one just there, and one at the bottom, which is quite hard to see, just there. And you can see there's like a wear mark there where the metal is kind of rubbed away. So this is where the friction is involved here, the moving parts, and this is the bit we need to lubricate with the brake lube. And like I said, you can just lift these brake shoes slightly forward, get a stick in here, lubricate this, push it back. You don't need to disassemble anything. But I've taken all of this apart so I can actually show you how it works and exactly, you know, the bits that need lubricating. So that's roughly how that works. And again, the same on the other side here. And then you'll also need to do the other side of the car too. So that's the number one thing that requires lubrication, the backing of the brake shoes. And you can see here, look, where this is kind of rubbing against the shoes. Now, if your drum brakes have self-adjusters, again, all drum brakes are going to be different. They're going to look slightly different. Some may have them, some may not. However, if you do have one, it will look something similar to this right here. Now, when talking about lubricating brakes, we talk about lubricating moving parts. Now, this is a very slow moving part because this slowly rotates like this as your brake shoes wear in your drum brakes. And it's super slowly because, you know, brakes don't wear really fast. So this will kind of slowly rotate over time, over weeks, and that will bring your brake shoes out. That's how the drum brakes work, as we talked about. However, if this gets kind of seized up, rusted in, maybe some brake shoe powder gets caught in here and it can't kind of rotate freely, then it's going to cause a problem with our drum brakes and not actually going to make good contact. So we have to put a bit of brake lubrication on these threads right here. Now this self-adjuster here, it's made of 3 pieces. There's that piece there, there's a secondary piece and a third piece. So what we're going to do, we're going to rotate this cog all the way out of its socket. So all the way out, there'll be a lot of threads on there, and the idea is we don't want this part seizing up in here. We want this to be able to rotate because that's how our drum brakes are supposed to work. Now we're just going to get a little bit of brake lubrication stuff here, our little silicone paste, and we're going to put it on the threads here. So all on these threads here, and then we're going to wind it in, wind it out, give it a bit more, wind it in, wind it out, and make sure it can rotate freely in its socket. So before we lubricate this self-adjuster here, we're going to make sure it's nice and clean of all kind of brake powder, oil, anything like that. So we're going to clean it up with brake parts cleaner, and then we're going to begin to lubricate it. So there we go, something like that, and that'll ensure some of this will stay in this sort of socket as well. Now, if you don't really live in a harsh environment, you know, where it typically gets rusty, or you have a nice car and you look after it, or it's new, you know, perhaps this is a step you might choose not to do. But I do recommend it, especially if you have like a 4x4 or you're doing a lot of off-roading or things like that. Then it's a good, you know, sort of measure to do with lubricating the brakes. Okay, so we'll just wound this all the way in, all the way as far as it'll go, and then we'll wind it out and just do it once more. That way we know for a fact it's all lubricated inside. So this rotates really smoothly now. If you have any excess kind of coming over the edges, just make sure to mop that up, and then we're going to reinstall this back into the car and rebuild the drum brake system back together again. I just want to say a real quick message to our viewers. I made this channel a few years ago, and its primary aim was to give you the skills, but more importantly the confidence in order to tackle pretty much any DIY job you may have. In the process, we've saved our viewers thousands of dollars or pounds or euros, whichever currency you want to use. I've put multiple hours of time into making videos each and every week, which I somehow juggle between family and a full-time job. If any of our videos on our channel helped you, please support our channel by clicking the thanks button underneath any video on this channel. You can choose how much you wish to donate. It's going to go right back into the channel towards videos, tools, and everything else. So thank you very much for that. When you make a donation towards the channel, you can put an optional message, and your message will be highlighted along all the comments for everybody to see. The bigger the donation, the bigger the highlight, so everybody can see how awesome you are. So I hope this video helped you with regards to brake lubrication on caliper based brakes or drum based brakes, and you have a bit of knowledge about what products to buy as well. So thank you for watching. I hope this helped, and take care.